For 10 years, the Vitale and Ferrara empires had been at war. Not a cold war, not a war of threats and posturing. A real war. The kind measured in bodies and burned buildings, and the particular silence that falls over a neighborhood when everyone who lives there has learned to stay indoors after dark. The kind of war that the underworld stopped trying to end, because the underworld had concluded, with the pragmatic resignation of men who deal in outcomes, that some fires do not go out. Marco Vitale started it with his fists and finished every chapter of it the same way. Broad, tattooed, immovable, a man who had climbed to the top of the most feared criminal empire on the Italian coast, not because he was born there, but because he had been willing, at every step, to be the most dangerous person in the room. His men did not love him. They did not need to. They feared him, and fear was a currency that never lost its value. Dante Ferrara fought a different kind of war, colder, more patient. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. He simply removed the things his enemies depended on, quietly, methodically, until they had nothing left to fight with. He had won every tactical engagement of the past decade. He was losing the war anyway, because winning tactical engagements against Marco Vitale was like removing bricks from a wall that kept rebuilding itself. The man simply would not fall. Then, on a Thursday evening in Rome, inside a restaurant that belonged to neither of them, something happened that 10 years of war, 10 years of negotiation, and 10 years of loss had never managed to produce. Both men stopped. Not because of a treaty, not because of a threat, not because either of them had run out of reasons to fight. Because a woman in black walked into the space between their raised fists. Calm, certain, arms extended. And the war, without explanation, without ceremony, without either man understanding why, paused. Two of the most feared men in the European underworld had been trying to destroy each other for a decade. It took one woman, no weapon, no army, no armor, just the particular courage of someone who has decided that enough is enough, to make both of them hesitate. Drop a heart if you already feel what this is going to cost her. Natalia is not a soldier. She is not an operative. She is a woman who built her life at the intersection of a war she didn't know she was living inside. And the night she walked between the guns, she changed everything. For both men and for herself. Hit that like button and subscribe to Mafia Tales, because Marco Vitale has never once backed down from anything in his life. Dante Ferrara has never once been stopped by anything he didn't see coming. And neither of them saw her coming. The restaurant was called Settembre. It occupied the ground floor of a 400-year-old building on a quiet street 3 blocks from the Piazza Navona. The kind of street that Rome produced without effort, beautiful and unhurried, with the particular quality of a city that has absorbed so much history it no longer bothers to announce it. The tables inside were set with white linen and simple candles. The menu changed with the season. The wine list was modest and exactly right. It was the kind of restaurant that serious people chose when they wanted to be somewhere that no one was performing anything. Natalia had built it over 8 years from nothing. From a lease she could barely afford, a kitchen she ran herself for the first 2 years, a reputation earned 1 table at a time, by a woman who understood instinctively that feeding people well was a form of trust, and that trust, once established, was the most durable thing in the world. She had no idea what she had built it between. She had no idea that the men who sat at the corner table on the first Tuesday of every month, quiet, well-dressed, speaking in low voices over the ossobuco, were lieutenants in the Vitale organization. She had no idea that the group who reserved the private room on alternate Thursdays, equally quiet, equally careful, reported to Dante Ferrara. She had simply noticed that both groups tipped well, caused no trouble, and returned with the regularity of people who had found somewhere they felt safe. She had noticed, because she noticed everything, that both groups carried the same exhaustion beneath their composure, the particular tiredness of people who have been at something very costly for a very long time. She had fed them. She had watched them. She had said nothing, because a restaurateur who lasts in Rome learns early that the business of survival is knowing which questions not to ask. That was Thursday. On Thursday, the Vitale table and the Ferrara table were both occupied for the first time simultaneously. A coincidence that Natalia registered with the mild professional concern of a woman calculating sightlines and ensuring neither group could see the other clearly. She had managed the seating with her usual precision. She had believed it was under control. It was not under control. The man who came through the kitchen door at 9:17 was not a customer. He was moving too fast, and his jacket sat wrong across the left shoulder. The particular wrongness of a concealed weapon worn by someone who is no longer trying to conceal what they are. Natalia had 1 second to understand what was happening before the room understood it too. Both tables were on their feet simultaneously. The sound of chairs pushed back hard, glass breaking, her staff pressed against the walls, her customers frozen. And in the center of the room, in the space between the white linen tables and the scattered glass, and the two groups of men who had been trying to end each other for 10 years, 2 men she had never seen before tonight, standing face to face, with their fists raised and their respective organizations fanned out behind them. Marco Vitale, on the left. She did not know his name yet. She knew his face, the broad jaw, the neck tattoos crawling up from the collar of a suit that strained across the shoulders. The absolute forward-leaning aggression of a man who does not step back. His eyes were locked on the man opposite, with the focused hostility of someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time and intends to make it count. Dante Ferrara, on the right. She did not know his name either. She knew his face, too, the clean-cut composure, the narrowed, calculating eyes, the faint bruise along his jaw that suggested he had arrived at this moment through violence and navigated it intelligently. He was not leaning forward. He was entirely still. The stillness of a man measuring outcomes rather than reacting to them. Behind each man, armed, ready, waiting. Natalia's restaurant, her white linen, her candles still burning. She did not think. She moved. She walked into the space between them, between the raised fists and the drawn weapons, and the 10 years of war that had just arrived inside her dining room. And she spread her arms, and she looked at neither man directly, and she said, in the voice she used when she needed a room to understand that something was over, the sentence that stopped everything. I know both of you, and neither of you wants to do this here. The room did not move. Marco Vitale looked at her. His jaw was still tight. His fists were still raised. But something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that was not quite hesitation and not quite recognition, but was close enough to both that his body did not complete the movement it had been building toward. Dante Ferrara looked at her. His calculation was still running. She could see it, the machinery of a man who assessed everything. He was assessing her. He was assessing the sentence. He was assessing what it meant that this woman had walked into the space between them without fear, and was standing there with the particular composure of someone who had already decided what she was prepared to lose. Neither man fired. Neither man moved. The candles burned on. The glass lay where it had fallen, and Natalia stood between two wars and waited for the room to catch up with the decision she had already made. She walked between their guns with nothing but the certainty that someone had to. Drop a heart if that sentence just stopped your breathing. Natalia doesn't know yet what she has just stepped into. She doesn't know the names of the two men she just stopped. She doesn't know that her restaurant has been the neutral ground of a decade-long war she was never told existed. Subscribe to Mafia Tales, because Marco Vitale has never in his life been stopped by anything. He just was. And neither of them will be able to explain why. Marco Vitale had not slept properly in 4 years. He knew the exact year it had started. The year the war had shifted from something he was winning into something he was simply sustaining. A fire that required constant fuel and produced nothing but ash. He did not admit this to anyone. He dressed each morning with the same precision he had always brought to the performance of being Marco Vitale. The suit, the posture, the expression that communicated absolute certainty. And he walked into his world, and his world responded the way it always had, with deference and fear, and the particular silence of men who understood that the wrong word at the wrong moment had consequences. He had built his empire from nothing, not from a family name or inherited territory, from the willingness, at 22 years old, to be the one person in a room full of dangerous men who was prepared to go further than anyone else. That willingness had taken him to the top of the most feared organization on the Neapolitan coast. It had given him the port, the routes, the network. It had cost him his brother, 2 of his closest lieutenants, and 7 years of the kind of sleep that comes without one eye open. The war with Ferrara had started on a Tuesday in October. A warehouse, a shipment. 3 of his men dead before anyone understood what was happening. He had responded the only way he knew how, with overwhelming, immediate, unambiguous force. He had been responding that way ever since. The problem was that Dante Ferrara did not respond to force the way other men did. He absorbed it, redirected it, used it. Marco had spent a decade throwing the full weight of his organization at an enemy who simply was not there when it landed, and he was beginning to understand. In the private hours before dawn, when understanding arrived, whether he wanted it or not, that this particular war might not have a conventional ending. He did not know what to do with that understanding, so he kept fighting. 400 kilometers north, Dante Ferrara sat in his Milan office at 11 in the evening, reviewing the same set of financial projections he had reviewed 3 times that week, and the numbers were telling him the same thing they had been telling him for 18 months. The war was becoming unsustainable. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but the kind of unsustainable that a careful man recognized early. A slow bleed from a wound that was not healing, draining resources at a rate that had seemed manageable a year ago and no longer did. Dante had built his empire on the principle that every conflict had a mathematical resolution, that if you controlled enough variables, the outcome became inevitable. He had applied this principle to the war with Vitale with considerable sophistication for 10 years. The mathematics were no longer resolving. He closed the folder. He looked at the window, the city below, organized and indifferent, continuing its business without any awareness of the calculations being conducted in this room. He thought about the Tuesday in October 10 years ago. The warehouse, the 3 dead men, the moment that had set everything in motion. He had been so certain then of what it meant. He had the evidence, he had the witnesses. He had constructed a response so precise and so thorough that there had been no question in his mind for a decade that his certainty was justified. He was still certain, but certainty and resolution were not the same thing, and he was 41 years old, and tired in a way that precision had stopped being able to address. His phone buzzed. A dinner in Rome on Thursday. A contact he needed to maintain. A conversation that could not be conducted remotely. He confirmed the reservation without looking at the name of the restaurant. He did not know that Marco Vitale had confirmed the same evening for a meeting 3 streets away. He did not know that both of them, independently and for completely unrelated reasons, had chosen the same part of the same city on the same night. He did not know about Settembre, about Natalia, about the white linen and the candles, and the woman who had spent 8 years building the precise ground on which everything was about to change. He closed his laptop. He would go to Rome on Thursday. The morning after was the color of broken things. Natalia stood in the center of her restaurant at 6:15 in the morning and looked at what Thursday night had left behind. 2 overturned tables. Glass in patterns across the floor that mapped the exact geometry of the previous evening's panic. A chair with a split leg. The white linen pulled from the corner table in a way that suggested someone had grabbed it on the way down. Her staff had been sent home at midnight once it was clear that whatever had happened was over, or at least paused. She had told them it was a fight between drunk customers that got out of hand. She did not know if they believed her. She did not know if she believed herself. She had stood between 2 men with raised fists and an army behind each of them and said 4 words, and the room had stopped. She had been standing in her own dining room for 12 years, first as a server, then as the owner, and she had never once been afraid of it. She was not sure what she felt about it now. Not afraid. Something more complicated than afraid. She started with the glass. She was on her knees with a dustpan at 6:45 when the door opened. 2 men she had not seen before, suits, careful posture, the practiced neutrality of people conducting a professional assessment. They looked at the room. They looked at her. "The owner?" one of them asked. "Yes, Mr. Vitale would like to speak with you." She had not known his name until that sentence. She filed it without expression, the way she filed everything, and stood up and set the dustpan aside. "Tell Mr. Vitale I'm available this afternoon, between 2 and 4, not before." The 2 men looked at each other. This was not a response they had been trained to process. "He prefers—" "I know what powerful men prefer," Natalia said, not unkindly. 2 o'clock. They left. She went back to the glass. At 7:53, different men arrived. Different suits, different posture, more contained, more precise in the way they occupied space. They asked the same question. She gave the same answer, adjusted by 2 hours. 4 o'clock. Tell Mr. Ferrara I'll make coffee. When they were gone, she sat down at the corner table, the Vitale table, she now understood, and looked at her restaurant in the early morning light and thought about what she had done and what it had made her and what the next several hours were going to require. Then she picked up her phone and called her supplier about the linen. Marco arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, with 2 men who waited outside the door at her instruction. He was larger than she had registered in the chaos of the previous evening, broad across the shoulders in a way that the suit accommodated rather than concealed, with the neck tattoos and the jaw and the particular physical density of a man who had never once in his adult life backed away from anything. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who was accustomed to controlling rooms and was currently in one he did not control. She poured water. She did not apologize for the condition of the restaurant. She let the silence sit for a moment, the particular silence of someone who is not in a hurry. And then she said, "Tell me how the war started." Marco's expression shifted. "That's not why I'm here." "I know why you're here. You want to understand why you lowered your weapon last night. I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you that I've been watching your people sit in that corner for 3 years, and they are tired, Mr. Vitale. You are tired. And tired men fighting wars that have no ending make mistakes that cost them everything." She set the water glass down. "So, tell me how it started." He told her. Not everything. She did not expect everything at a first meeting, but enough. The warehouse, the Tuesday in October, the 3 men, the certainty that had driven every subsequent decision. She listened without interrupting. She noticed everything. Dante arrived at 4. He was everything Marco was not. Contained, precise. The kind of man who assessed a room in the time it took to cross it, and arrived at his chair already knowing more than he had when he walked in. He accepted the coffee. He looked at her with narrowed eyes that were calculating rather than hostile. She asked him the same question. His account of the Tuesday in October was precise, detailed, and documented with the confidence of a man who had reviewed the evidence many times. The warehouse, the fire, the 3 dead men. She listened. She noticed. When he was gone, she sat alone in the restaurant with the early evening light coming through the windows, and 2 versions of the same Tuesday in her head. The same event, the same outcome, 2 completely different accounts of how it had started. She poured herself a glass of wine, the first of the day, later than usual, and sat with the inconsistency that was sitting in the room with her. Both men were certain. Both men had evidence. Both men had spent 10 years and everything it cost them on the absolute conviction that the other side had fired first. Both could not be right. One of them, or neither of them, was telling the truth they had been given, which meant someone else had told it. She did not know yet who, but she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent a decade learning to read what rooms were really saying beneath what people said in them, that the question was the most important one she had ever asked. She went to find the contractor. The renovation had started in March and stopped in April, when Giulio, the contractor who had done every job in this building for 6 years, had sent a 2-line message saying he had taken work elsewhere and would not be returning. No explanation, no referral, no response to the 3 calls she had made afterward. She had found another contractor and thought nothing more of it until now. The section of the north wall that Giulio had been working on, a damp repair behind the bar, structural rather than cosmetic, had been left half-finished. The new contractor had patched it without removing the original plasterwork. Natalia had accepted the result because the wall looked fine, and she had not had the bandwidth to care about anything she could not see. She stood in front of it at 11:45 at night, with the restaurant empty and a chisel she had found in the storage cupboard. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for. She was sure enough to be here. The plaster came away in sections. Beneath it, original stone, a cavity that the building had been carrying for 4 centuries without anyone knowing. And inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, with the careful attention of someone who expected it to be there for a long time, a sealed envelope. She sat down on the floor behind the bar with the oilcloth in her lap and opened it. A letter, financial records, a timeline, and a name at the bottom of the letter that she did not recognize, but that connected through the financial records to both empires. Not as an enemy of either, but as a supplier. A man who had sold weapons to the Vitale organization and financial services to Ferrara's network, quietly, for 15 years. A man who needed both organizations to remain in conflict in order to remain necessary to both. She read it twice. Then she sat in her empty restaurant at midnight and understood, completely and without any remaining uncertainty, what she was holding. The Tuesday in October, the burned warehouse, the 3 dead men. Neither empire had done it. She went to Marco first. 8 in the morning, no appointment, which was itself a message. She had established by now that she was the kind of woman who made appointments, and arriving without one, communicated the specific urgency of something that could not wait. He was at a table in a back room of a building near the port, 3 men around him, coffee on the table. He looked at her when she walked in and sent the 3 men out with a movement of his hand that required no words. She put the documents on the table. He read them without speaking. She watched his face, the jaw tightening, the particular stillness that preceded movement in a man like Marco, the moment where calculation and fury arrived simultaneously, and the calculation held the fury in place long enough to understand what it was looking at. He reached the name at the bottom. Something broke across his face. Not dramatically, the way things break in men who do not permit themselves to break. A fracture running through 10 years of absolute certainty, and underneath it, something rawer and older than anger. "Luca Carano," he said. His voice was completely level. That levelness was the most frightening thing she had heard from him. "Yes?" she said. He looked at her. "How long have you known?" "Since last night." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ferrara." It was not a question. He already knew what she was going to do next. She could see him calculating it. The same destination she was carrying the documents to, and what it would mean when both men arrived there simultaneously. "Yes," she said. She left him with the documents and drove north. Dante read more slowly. He was the kind of man who read everything twice before reacting to any of it, and she let him, sitting across the table in his Milan office, with the particular patience of a woman who had already delivered this news once and understood what it took to receive it. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. She did not speak. She had learned, in the weeks of carrying messages between these 2 men, that Dante Ferrara's silences were processing rather than absence. There was more happening in them than in most men's words. "Carano has been supplying both of us for 15 years, he said finally. "Yes." "He needed the war to continue." "Yes." "We have been—" He stopped, started again. "I have been—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The particular devastation of an intelligent man discovering that the most calculated room in Rome had been outmaneuvered completely, thoroughly, for a decade, was visible in the set of his jaw, and the stillness of his hands, and the careful way he looked at nothing. "Marco knows," Dante said. "He will by now." He looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, the calculating composure was not entirely in place. There was something underneath it, not vulnerability exactly, but the precursor to it. The moment before a very controlled man allows himself to feel the weight of something. "What happens now?" he asked. "That," Natalia said, standing, "is the first question either of you has asked me that I'm going to let you answer for yourself." She left him with the documents and drove back to Rome. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, not to her phone, to the restaurant's landline, which almost nobody used, which was why she answered it without thinking. A man's voice, calm, professional, completely without inflection. He told her that the documents she had found were a private matter. That private matters had a way of becoming complicated for people who involved themselves in them. That she should consider whether her restaurant, her staff, her suppliers, the life she had built, was worth the complication. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a specific threat. He simply described the shape of what could happen, in the manner of someone describing weather. She set the phone down. She sat for a moment, with the particular clarity that arrives when a decision has been made for you by the thing you were already deciding. Then she sent a message to Marco's contact number, the one he had given her at the end of their second meeting, pressed into her hand without comment. The gesture of a man who had decided she was worth the risk of being reachable. The message was 4 words. Carano knows, I know. She sent the same message to Dante. Then she locked the restaurant and went upstairs to her apartment above it and sat by the window that looked out onto the quiet Roman street and waited. Marco arrived at 9:47. She heard the car before she saw it. 2 vehicles, men moving to positions around the building with the practiced efficiency of a security operation she had never needed to think about before tonight. Dante arrived at 9:51. Different car, same positioning, same efficiency. She watched from the window as both sets of men registered each other's presence simultaneously. She went downstairs and opened the restaurant door. Both men were standing on the pavement outside, 4 feet apart, the same distance as the night in the dining room, looking at each other with the particular expression of 2 people who have arrived at the same place from completely opposite directions and are only now understanding that the journey was the same. She stepped between them. It was becoming, she noted distantly, a habit. "He knows I have the documents," she said. "Which means he's moving. Which means whatever either of you is going to do, tonight is when you do it." Both men looked at her, then at each other. Neither of them spoke. But something passed between them in the silence, the specific communication of 2 people who have spent a decade learning to read each other's intentions, discovering for the first time that the intention they were reading was identical to their own. Marco nodded once. Dante's jaw set. "Together," Dante said. It was not a question. "Together," Marco confirmed. It was the first word they had ever spoken to each other that was not the prelude to violence. Luca Carano operated from a converted warehouse on the edge of the city. The particular irony of that detail was not lost on either man as they approached it. He had been there 15 years. He had made his fortune in the space between 2 empires that he had constructed specifically to need him. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful criminal architects in the Italian underworld, and he had achieved it without a single name in a newspaper or a single incident that could be traced back to him. He had made one error. He had underestimated the woman who ran the restaurant. They went in at 11. Marco's men on the perimeter, force, presence, the physical architecture of someone who has closed all exits. Dante's men inside, quiet, positioned, the information network of someone who had been mapping this building for 3 days before anyone entered it. Natalia had provided the layout. Not because either man had asked her. She had drawn it from memory on a sheet of paper and handed it to both of them separately, because she understood that the information she had was the weapon that mattered more than anything either empire could bring through the door, and she was not going to stand outside while other people used it. Carano was at his desk when they walked in together. She watched his face make the calculation. Vitale and Ferrara in the same room, on the same side, and watched him understand, in the 2 seconds before anything else happened, that the war he had built his life on had just ended. The conversation was brief. Dante had the financial records. Marco had 3 witnesses. Carano, a man who had survived 15 years in the underworld by being a precise calculator of outcomes, calculated this one accurately and made no attempt at negotiation. It was not a clean resolution. The underworld did not produce clean resolutions, but it was conclusive, and it was over. And when they walked back out into the Roman night, Natalia stood between 2 men who had just done the same thing for the first time in 10 years, and felt the particular weight of an ending. The weeks that followed had a quality of gradual decompression, the slow release of pressure that a decade of sustained conflict had built into every operation, every relationship, every habit of mind both empires had developed. Soldiers stood down, operations were suspended. Territory disputes that had been active for years were left quietly uncontested. The machinery of the war did not stop immediately. It slowed, then slowed further. Then, by increments too small to point to individually, it stopped. On a Tuesday in November, the same day of the week the war had started, which neither man commented on, Marco Vitale and Dante Ferrara sat across a table from each other in Settembre for the first time without weapons between them or Natalia's arms between their fists. She had set the table herself. 2 place settings, the good linen, a bottle of Barolo she had been keeping for an occasion she had never been able to name. She brought the wine and poured it and went back to the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and watched them through the pass. These 2 men, physically so different, carrying between them the accumulated weight of a decade that had cost both of them more than either would ever fully account for. Marco, with his hands around the wine glass, the tattoos visible, the jaw no longer tight in the way she had first seen it. Dante, with his elbows on the table, the composure present but different now, less like armor and more like nature. They were not friendly. She did not expect friendly. They were 2 men who had destroyed each other's operations and killed each other's people, and spent 10 years as the dominant fact of each other's existence. And none of that was going to become simple over a bottle of Barolo. But they were talking. That was the word for it. Not negotiating, not calculating, not managing. Talking. The way people talk when the performance has been set aside, and what remains is just the conversation. She went back to the kitchen. She had a service to run. The restaurant filled that evening the way it always filled. The regulars, the new faces, the particular warm noise of a room where people were eating well and had stopped, for the duration of the meal, being whatever else they were in the world. Natalia moved between the tables the way she always had, reading the rooms, managing the tensions, being exactly what each table needed her to be. The corner table and the private room both had occupants, different men than before, quieter, with the particular demeanor of organizations that have stood down from something and are not yet sure who they are without it. She served them both. She said nothing she was not asked. She watched everything. The war was over. The restaurant endured. And somewhere in the city, Two men who had been each other's entire world for a decade were driving home, separately, in different directions, thinking about a woman who had walked between their guns with nothing but the conviction that someone had to, and who had not, even once, asked either of them for anything in return. Neither of them had an adequate word for what that was. Both of them were going to spend a considerable amount of time trying to find one.